in chapter 14 of Genesis. So we're kind of making our way through the book of Genesis, and we're main character here is Abram, and then of course Lot will be in that, and we'll meet an Old Testament person, I guess I should say, that is also mentioned in the New Testament besides Abram. So I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Melchizedek. Has anybody ever heard of Melchizedek? Right? Get a few head shaking. So this is lesson 17 if you're keeping count. So we'll just kind of moving along, trying to hit the highlights. Genesis is loaded with all kinds of doctrinal things and all kinds of things that carry forward into the New Testament. So that's why we have begun to study that. Genesis chapter 14, I'm going to read the first 10 verses. Usually don't go that many verses at one time, but there's a whole lot. It's very wordy here. They're going to be talking about a war that is going to be happening around Abram. And so we'll go ahead and get started. Right? And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar. Let me just give you a hint. I think I've said this before. When you're speaking and you go past a word, especially a name that you don't know how to pronounce, just pronounce it with confidence. Nobody else is going to know it anyway. I'm telling you, it's the truth. So, even names now that we think we know how to pronounce, that somebody will pronounce it differently, right? So, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. All these joined together in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. There is a valley that runs, obviously, at the Salt Sea there, because otherwise water wouldn't collect there, right? So there is a valley. I have been there. There's been some battles that occurred there besides this. So it is, I've been there, is all I can say. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and attacked the Rephaim in Ashtoreth, Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Emim in Sheba, Kiriathim, and the Horites in their mountain of Seir, as far as El Paran. I should have had one of y'all read this, which is by the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh. Have you ever heard of Kadesh before? Kadesh Barnea is a place as well. And attacked all the country of the Amalekites and also the Amorites who dwell in Hazazon Tamar. And the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out and joined together in battle in the valley of Siddim against Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of nations, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Eleazar. Sum all of that up, 4 kings against 5. It would have been nice if they had just said that at the beginning and left out all those names, but they're there. And those names are important. They do have significance for later on, but that would have been nice. Now the valley of Siddim was full of asphalt pits, and the kings of Sodom, we've heard of Sodom and Gomorrah, fled. Some fell there, and the remainder fled to the mountains. So there is a battle, or a war, I guess, that's about to take place. 4 kings against 5. Remember, we told you, well, over a couple of weeks now, that this is the area that is the promised land. And so, obviously, Israel doesn't occupy it yet. They will not occupy it for over 400 years until Moses will lead them, and then eventually Joshua will take them into the promised land. There are people that are very evil in the sight of God that are occupying this land, and they're warring against one another. The problem is that how many remember from last week where Lot is? Where's he at? He's near what?
Sodom.
He's near Sodom, right? So he is right there, and we're going to see what happens to him in a little bit. So there's this confederation of kings. They rebel against another king, and they wanted to be free from his dominion. So this happens even today, that people rebel and come against the leader. So, so the valley of Siddim was full of asphalt pits, and they're in this whole region. So the danger there is that some people could fall into these. The best I can tell you is like tar pits, right? And so there's danger in this area when they begin to war against one another. Let's read verse 11 and 12. So, I think I asked how many kings were in this war.
None.
So, none, right? 4 and 5. Last time I checked, it's not new math now, but last time I checked, 4 plus 5 equals 9. Still does, right? So, that's the answer to that question. Let's see. All right. So now we're going to see how Lot is involved. I shouldn't say involved. He's just there. And negative things happen to him. What's the lesson in this for us is when we're not where we're supposed to be, lots of times we get into trouble, right? It wasn't a good place for Sodom to be, for Lot to be. He's near Sodom. We already know from the history that we know now that Sodom and Gomorrah are annihilated because they're so evil in the sight of God. So here's Lot, and he's hanging out, and he's in the wrong place at the wrong time. That'll get you in trouble, won't it? So it says, then they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, Abram's brother's son, that means it's Abram's nephew, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and they departed. So this is Abram's kin. Now, remember me saying last week that when we're disobedient to God's plan, it creates trouble. Not only did it create trouble for Lot, but now it's created trouble for Abram because Abram was instructed not to bring him in the first place. Now Abram's going to have to go out and rescue Lot when he shouldn't have been there in the first place. If he had just followed after God's plan and left his family, I know that sounds, harsh to say, but that's what God told him to do, and especially his father's family. And you're supposed to leave them. So we see the trouble that comes from this. So Abram was an honorable man, obviously loved his family, and he's going to go fight and try to bring his nephew and all of his goods back. Just a quote from Charles Spurgeon. I've said it in many different ways, but sometimes it's good to hear somebody else say that. Believers who conform to the world must expect to suffer for it. So here is Lot, and he is conforming to the world because he's not only dwelling in the plains of Sodom and Gomorrah, that's how he starts, but now he's actually a leader in Sodom, and he's living inside of the city, if you will. So very interesting as we see that. Let's read verses 13 and 14. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram, the Hebrew. By the way, that's the first use of the word Hebrew in the Bible. So they told Abram, the Hebrew, for he dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and the brother of Aner, and they were allies with Abram. So one of the persons that got captured in this battle gets away, and they come and they tell Abram about the situation, and they are allies with Abram. If you know anything, if you've been with us and listening, or just even read your Bible, you know that Abram was a rich man and had lots of servants and all kinds of things. So he came to tell Abram, thinking that maybe Abram can help and do something about it, right? So let's read the 13 and 14. Then we read that part. Now when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, this is actually his brother's son, but when his brother was taken captive, he armed his 318 trained servants. I think there's a question on there. So 318 men who are trained to fight. Now, Abram is in a country that eventually he's going to inherit, or his family will eventually inherit, but not right now. It's going to be several hundred years later. So he is smart. He has these men trained to be ready for battle. And so he has 318 of them who were born in his own house, and he went in pursuit as far as Dan. Dan is one of the, have you ever heard of the word Dan used in the Bible? It is, Danny, I don't know if you know this, but it's one of the tribes of Israel. It's also a location because the tribes were given specific inheritances in the promised land, and Dan is farther up to the north. That's the name. And so we'll see that later on, but it's a location there, and he went in pursuit as far as them, as Dan, I should say. What does these 318 trained soldiers, if you will, tell us about Abram? I think I've already said it, but
He's wealthy.
He's wealthy, right? That's a lot of men. Especially, it says they came from his house. That means he owned them. He was in charge of them. They were working for him. So it demonstrates his wealth and that he could assemble that many people to help him. Demonstrates that he was also very influential, right? Rich as well as influential. Again, not that it's not in your questions, but Dan is the far northern border of Israel. Let's read verses 15 through 17. While this is a lengthy story, there are just a few things that we want to highlight here, more so in the second half of the chapter, but it is important to see how that God was with Abram, and God helped Abram, even though Abram had initially been out of God's will, and for sure Lot was out of God's will. But how many knows that sometimes when we get out of God's will, he's going to help us anyway, right? Because he's merciful. I'm glad that he does help us when we get out of his will, because I've gotten out of his will before. Have you, right? So we see the mercy of God here to help Abram. So Abram, whenever he finds out this news, he divides his forces against them by night. We'll talk about that here in just a second. And his servants attacked them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. So he brought back all the goods, and also brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people. So notice, at first it said they just got the goods, but it was the women and the people as well. So it wasn't just the men that got taken away, it was women as well. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Sheba, that is the king's valley, after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him. So, not only is Abram wealthy, not only is he influential, but he's wise. He's wise in battle, right? We see that he does what is a very a strategy of war. He divides his men, Doesn't tell us how he did it, but I imagine either, north and south, front and behind, or east and west. He divides the men, and he attacks by night. What's the advantage of attacking by night? It's like, surprise, right? And they were able to get back everything, and they were successful. And so they were able to seize all of the goods, rescue Lot, recover all the plunder that had been taken, and we see that is a good thing. The negative thing in it is that Lot moves right back where he started. Not a good thing, right? Didn't really learn a lesson from it. I mean, the Lord wants us to learn a lesson from the things we experience, right? He really does. Ken is here tonight. He's not feeling well, but I'm in his Bible study every Tuesday night, and he always says that his dad said, you pay for your education in one way or another. Ken says that all the time. He probably told Tiffany that, right? Sometimes you pay for your education by experiencing the negative things that happen because you weren't following after God's plan, right? So we are always paying for our education. Sometimes it's a positive thing, sometimes a negative thing that we experience because we haven't learned. So let's look at this, and I just want to, just for a few moments, look at what Abram did for Lot, because here is an Old Testament prototype of what Jesus will do and has done for us. And if we don't slow down here and look at it, we'll miss it. Do you see Christ in this? It's a story of Abram rescuing Lot, someone who was out of God's will, in sin, in shame, and he gets rescued. How many knows that's us, right? When we were sinners, we were rescued by our kinsman redeemer. That's what Christ is for us. Because Christ is our brother, right? We are God's children. He's the Son of God. We're His children. So it's we have a kinsman redeemer there who helps us. And he went to a great trouble and a great distance. Jesus came from heaven, right, to rescue us. And he laid aside all of those heavenly privileges, I guess I should say, and he came to earth to be a man to rescue us. So that you see all of this. Abram's courageous, and he defeats the enemy that had put us in bondage. Wow, so here's the good news of the gospel in Genesis chapter 14. It's just a prototype of what will come, what Christ will do for us. So how many have ever read that and not thought about that? I can tell you I have. I looked at that and I was like, oh, wow, that's powerful when we begin to look at that Old Testament. What does the Bible tell us that the Old Testament does? It is a shadow of things to come. It foretells of things that will happen. So when we look at the Old Testament, we can, if we look closely, sometimes we see some of those things.
Old Testament's the New Testament concealed.
Yeah, Old Testament is the New Testament concealed. The New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. It's one way to look at it, right? So we see things that will be concealed in the Old Testament come to pass. What about the prophecy of a Messiah that's to come? Comes to pass in the New Testament. What about that he'll be born of a virgin? Mentioned in the Old Testament. Happens in the New. So Old Testament concealed, New Testament revealed is one way to think about that. I think it's a very, very powerful way to do that. All right, let's look at verses 18 through 20. And let me say up front, I've read many, many commentaries on Melchizedek. They don't all agree. So we will look at this and we'll do our best to say who Melchizedek was, maybe who he wasn't, and look at this. I will tell you that he is definitely a type of Christ, but whether or not, and this is where the disagreement is that is this a theophany? And that's just a fancy word of saying Christ being present in the Old Testament, revealed there. Is that actually a theophany, or is it just a type? And so that's where the commentaries sometimes disagree. I have some thoughts, but who am I, right? But we do see it's going to teach us some things here anyway, even if we don't know exactly how to understand the character or the person of Melchizedek. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem. King of Salem. Now, so I think in the question I asked for a description, what is he in that first verse? So number one, he's the king of Salem. It says he brought out bread and wine. That's interesting. You probably ought to note that. He was the priest of God Most High. One thing you need to know about Salem, when it's mentioned in the Old Testament, it is the old Jerusalem. The old Jerusalem. So Salem, you can see how they get to it being named Jerusalem, right? So we see that. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand, and he gave him a tithe of all. I had one question. How do you read that? It was actually in a commentary, because you could read that as if Melchizedek gave a tithe to Abram. Most commentaries agree that it was Abram that gave a tithe to Melchizedek, which makes sense in this story. But anyway, so here's Melchizedek. What we don't know about Melchizedek is more than we do know about him, to be honest with you. It's the truth. And sometimes you see characters, sometimes God doesn't tell us everything about someone. Sometimes, now not in this, but sometimes there's a purpose. So in the New Testament, you see Jesus and he heals a woman. We don't know her name, but we know that she's had a blood disorder for 12 years. Why would the Bible not tell us her name?
HIPAA laws.
Huh?
HIPAA laws.
HIPAA laws. I love that. Why might the Bible not give us her name? Might be more reasons than what I'm thinking.
Didn't want to embarrass her?
Well, yeah, I mean, it could have. It depends on how quickly this was written after, that was written after she could have still been alive. What else?
Her name really didn't matter, but her faith did.
Her name didn't matter, but her faith did. So the bigger picture was the faith, not the name of the woman.
She may have never said her name to him.
True. She may never have said. I hadn't thought about that. And I think, too, is that sometimes when the name is anonymous, that it has greater application for someone else who might be in a similar situation. Think about that. Because if it's specific and it mentions a name, we could think, well, God just did that for her. But when it's just a woman, and we don't know, but we only know her circumstances, we could say, well, if God did that for her, we don't know who her is, maybe he could do something like that for me, right? So there's reasons why we may know less about a person, but more about their circumstance than who they really are. So we don't know where Melchizedek came from, how he came to be in Canaan, the promised land. We don't know how he came to be a worshiper of the true God. And we don't know how Abram came to know him. We just know he was there.
We don't know who appointed him priest. We don't know who
Right,
put him in as king.
right. Now, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but since you mentioned that, there's very few characters in the Bible that are both priest and king. So he is very important, very powerful. Obviously, Abram honors him, respects him, gives enough to give him his tithe and to sit with him, right? And Abram's an important character, but here's Melchizedek, which I will tell you is a type of Christ. Whether or not he was Christ in pre-incarnation form, can't know that for sure, but he's definitely a type of Christ because of some of the things that we do know about him. Bill said, that's important.
I said we don't know who appointed him, either one of them.
No, we don't. That's
Or
good.
who elected him.
That's true. We don't know who ordained him. We don't know who selected him to be this king or this priest. We do know, however, this is where I was going to go, I forgot. We do know that Christ is referred to as both a king and a priest in the Bible. Hebrews tells us that he is our high priest, right?
But the difference from what I've read, and I think we just had a Sunday school lesson about it, the only difference is that he was both prophet, priest, and king, and nobody else could claim all three.
Right. Good point. I think my wife told me the other day that you said, I'm always on your Sunday school lesson, so I apologize in advance.
But you always are.
You're always on my lessons too, so.
That's all right. Hey, that's when we know maybe the Lord's moving in the theme, right?
Right.
So we see that he is both priest and king. Christ is referred to as that. He is King of Kings in Revelation. He's Lord of Lords. In Hebrews, he is our high priest who offers himself, and his blood is greater than that of lambs and goats and all of that kind of thing. So we see that about this Melchizedek. And by the way, the name Melchizedek, which also lets us know that he is a type, a prototype, if you want to say that. He is a type in the Old Testament of Christ. His name means King of Righteousness. That's in your questions. King of Righteousness. How many knows, and I think it's in Revelation as well, that he's called the Righteous One. The Lord is, right? So here we have Melchizedek. His name means King of Righteousness. He's the king of Salem, which is the original Jerusalem. He's a priest of God Most High. By the way, that particular name of the Lord that's the first mention of God Most High. And you notice later on that Abram actually uses that because I think he just likes that. Have you ever heard somebody worshiping the Lord or preaching or whatever, and they say something you just grab a hold of that because you like it, right? It speaks to you. So Abram actually uses this term later. He was a worshiper, a priest of the true God, ruling over Jerusalem in ancient times. As I said before, he is king and priest. In the Bible, with the exception of Christ, most times when someone is a king or is a priest and tries to assume the role of the other, it's not a good situation. And there was a king, Uzziah, who tried to do the work of a priest, and God strikes him with leprosy. Because though they're not supposed to do that. The king's not supposed to act like a priest. The priest's not supposed to act like a king in the Old Testament, right? There's separate roles. And you even see, where God will he'll discipline whenever that happens. So priest of God Most High, it's the Hebrew word El Elyon, which is highest God, the supreme God. Notice what he brings. What does he bring?
Bread and wine.
Bread and wine. Does that sound familiar? What does it sound like? Sounds like communion, right? So here is pre-Christ being born, pre-crucifixion, pre-Christ saying, this is my body, eat you all of it, this is my blood for the remission of sin. All of that and here Melchizedek, again, it's a type. He is offering bread and wine. So very interesting when we see these foreshadowing in the Old Testament. Bread and wine of Passover, and then obviously of communion, and it speaks of the sacrifice of Christ. When I read this, I centered on a word because I've preached twice on being blessed by God. Notice what Melchizedek does. He blesses Abram. Right? Because, again, he's a priest, and he has the authority to speak blessings. If you're sorry, and most of you are, on my Sunday morning sermon, but we're also priests of the Lord. A royal priesthood, a holy nation, all of those things. So what does that say about us? That we are to speak blessings as well. I just love everywhere, it seems like everything I pick up here lately, it's blessed, blessing, all these kinds of things that we see, that because he's a God that just wants to bless us, right? And as we've talked before, the blessing isn't just financial, it's many other things that I spoke about Sunday. So, Melchizedek, also mentioned in the book of Psalms. Psalm 110, verse 4, says the priesthood of the Messiah is a priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek, as opposed to being after the order of Aaron. So that's interesting. When God actually selected Aaron and his family line to be priest, but yet the priesthood of the Messiah, why is that? Because we don't know, or they didn't know, where he came from or anything else about it, right? Not really. They thought they did, but they didn't. So Hebrews 7:3, another mention of Melchizedek, is that he's described as without father, without mother, obviously, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. When you read Hebrews 7:3, it makes you think that this was not a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ, because he is a priest like, right? Not like unto the Son of God. So I kind of lean that way, that he is simply a type, although a very strong picture of what Christ will come and do for us. So when you read the Old Testament, as we just said, talking about Old Testament is Christ concealed, New Testament Christ revealed, all those kinds of things. Really look for those if you can think about it, and see this mention before it actually happens of what the Lord will do. And so Abram gives a tithe of all. That word, tithe of all, that phrase, I thought it was interesting. It didn't just mean he gave a tenth of his assets or a tenth of his income. It means he gave a tenth of all of his assets. That's a big tithe. because he was a wealthy man.
Was it all of that, or was it just all of the spoils of war?
It could have been just all of the spoils of war, but I don't know. It's a good question.
I thought that was hard because he didn't take the spoils of war.
Yeah.
That's true, he didn't take the spoils of war. So, because the only thing he did was he allowed the men that were with him to take their portion of the spoil. So it would have been from his income and assets of Abram. So very interesting. So as I said before, Melchizedek is a picture or a type of Christ in the Old Testament. Illustrates the eternal priesthood of Christ, because we didn't know where Melchizedek came from. It doesn't talk about a beginning or ending for him. It's a foreshadowing of Christ that will be coming. So let's read verses 21 through 24, and we're getting closer to finishing up. Now the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the persons and take the goods for yourself." But Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I have raised my hand to the Lord, God Most High." Notice that? He mentions God Most High after he hears Melchizedek say that. "The possessor of heaven and earth, that I will take nothing from a thread to a sandal strap, and that I will not take anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich, except only what the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men who went with him, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them take their portion." So, now was it wrong for the guy to offer this to Abram? Obviously not. I mean, he's very grateful for what Abram's been able to do in rescuing and bringing back the spoils and bringing back the people that had been taken in battle. So it wasn't wrong for him to be offered that, but Abram didn't want to take it. Didn't want to do that, even though he had, from a war standpoint, he had the right to take that, right? Because he had been successful in battle. And why didn't he want to do it? Because he wanted God to get the glory, right? He wanted all of the credit for his success and his wealth to go to God and God alone. So, this is not saying that we can't be paid for things we have done. This is simply an oath that Abram took. I don't know if it doesn't tell us when he took this. He may have took this oath whenever he came back from being in Egypt. Remember how that king blessed him with all those donkeys and camels and all those kinds of things. But when he gets back, maybe possibly to the promised land, he makes an oath with God that he's not going to take anything from anybody, so that God will get the glory for the success and the wealth that he has. So, interesting there. He was generous in that he gave spoil to those who went and helped him. We should be generous to those who help us. Amen?
I was just looking at
Question?
the message in Hebrews 7:2 says he gave Melchizedek a tenth of the spoils of war, and I guess that's where I got that from, because I know I read it once somewhere.
Right. Yeah, and it's not totally clear there
No.
exactly what he does, what he's tithing on, but it's still. And I forgot to mention this. I can't believe I forgot that. So we have many people in our day, let's just say the New Testament day, and this is true, but they don't consider what Abraham did with Melchizedek. They'll say, well, the tithe is it wasn't, it's just, that's not something that we should be doing. because that's the law. Well, it was the law, but it predates the law. There is no law at this time. Moses is 400 and something years away from being born, right? And there's no law, but yet predating the law, Abram tithes to this priest. Very interesting. So I think, honestly, some of the principles and the things in the Bible are universal. What I mean when I say that, they span from the Old Testament all the way to the New. And I believe that tithing is that way. That we as the people of God ought to tithe. You're not going to see a command to do it in the New Testament because it was already a principle that was in action. I believe it was assumed that the people of God would tithe and give offerings, right? I don't know if you know this or not, but if you look at the Jewish custom and tradition for how much they gave, you'd be happy to just give a tenth. That's the truth. Because they gave about 30% of their income. One portion would go to the priest. Another portion would go to the house of God. Another portion went to the poor. And they were all a tenth. That's 30%. Anyway, you add it up. Even new math, it's 30%, right? So it's very interesting that, you know, we look at that, and I'm in my core group here, and that's I mean, I'll just say this. I might not preach it this hard on a Sunday morning, but I believe that tithing is just a place to start. I believe tithing is a place to start, that we shouldn't only want to tithe and not ever give more beyond that. I think tithing is a place to start. Now, will we be blessed if we just tithe? Absolutely. Because the Bible is very specific that when we tithe, we give to the Lord. By the way, it says that that's already the Lord's. So I have to ask myself a question, is if that was already His and that's all I'm giving, did I really technically give anything?
He's letting us keep 90.
He's letting us keep 90. The interesting thing about, I'll challenge you, the interesting thing that I've discovered over my life, and tithing is not new at all to me. My dad was secretary treasurer of the church. When I mowed a yard, Dad was like, that means, not because he was greedy for the money to come into the church, but wanted to teach because it's a blessing, right? And so I think that tithing we're blessed by it. I think it teaches us, beyond just to give back to the Lord, it actually teaches us to manage what we have better. I'm just being direct as I can be. So God says, give me the 10th, and the 90% will go farther than the 100% did. That doesn't make, talk about math, that doesn't make math sense, right? But it's the truth. I've experienced it. When I blessed the Lord, there were times in my younger life when Teresa and I first got married that I was afraid to do the checkbook because I knew it didn't make sense how I was still making it. Anybody ever been in a place like that? I mean, I'm being honest and truthful to you. It was some lean times, but I never went without. I never had to beg for food or anything like that. So it's actually management teaches us to manage what we have, and it's a blessing to us, even when we think, oh, I have to give this up. It's actually a blessing. So it's very interesting. Let's go over the questions. How many kings were involved in the war?
9.
Most of these we've answered pretty directly. What happened to Lot according to verse 12?
Became a prisoner of war.
Right. He became a prisoner of war. They took his possessions. They took him. Right. According to verse 14, question number 3, what did Abram do when he heard about what happened to Lot?
Went to get it.
Went to get him. He took his army of trained servants and went in pursuit. Question 4. Oh man.
Good word.
That's a typo. That's when you type real fast, you don't catch it, and the O comes before the D. It's supposed to say what does.
And it's a word, so spell check doesn't catch
Yeah, spell check. What? Yeah, an ode is a word. So, what does this large number of fighting men demonstrate? He said, it's all
Powerful and
powerful, influential, wealthy. According to verse 15, question number 5, what was Abram's military strategy? Attack at night, divide his
forces
Then,
in both
you know,
directions.
either left, right, front, back, somehow. He divided them up. So interesting. According to verse 18, not just everywhere else, but according to verse 18, how is Melchizedek described? There's two descriptions.
King of Salem.
King of Salem,
Most High.
priest of the Most High, of God Most High. Very good. What does the word Melchizedek mean?
King of righteousness.
King of righteousness. Question 8. What did Melchizedek serve Abram?
Bread and wine.
Bread and wine. Very good. And then the final question, why would Abraham refuse the spoil from the war?
He didn't want to be obligated to Melchizedek for one.
Well, that's something we didn't say, but that's true. And he wants God to get all the credit for his success and his wealth.